scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa had always been afraid of her bedroom closet, but tonight her fear felt justified. The closet door, which she always kept firmly closed, was standing slightly ajar, and through the gap, she could see movement in the darkness beyond. At first, she thought it might be her clothes swaying in a breeze, but there was no wind in her room, and the movement was too deliberate, too purposeful. As she watched, small hands appeared at the edge of the door, pushing it open wider. The hands were pale and thin, with fingers that seemed too long for a child. More hands appeared, then arms, then faces that looked almost like children she knew, but with features that were slightly wrong: eyes too large, smiles too wide, skin too pale. The closet children began to emerge one by one, moving with silent, gliding steps that made no sound on the wooden floor. They arranged themselves around her bed in a perfect circle, all facing her with those unnaturally large eyes. Peppa tried to call for her parents, but no sound came from her throat. The closet children began to whisper in unison, their voices creating a sound like wind through dead leaves. They were speaking her name, but pronouncing it wrong, stretching the syllables until it became something alien and frightening. As they whispered, they began to reach toward her with those impossibly long fingers, their movements slow and hypnotic. Peppa realized that the children looked familiar because they were versions of all her friends from school, but changed, corrupted, made wrong. The closest child, who looked like a twisted version of Susie Sheep, opened its mouth to speak, and instead of words, a sound like static filled the room. One by one, the other children opened their mouths, adding to the static until the sound became overwhelming, drowning out everything else in a wave of white noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa's living room had always been filled with her toys and dolls, but lately, she noticed they weren't where she left them. Every morning, the dolls would be arranged in different positions, as if they had been playing together during the night. At first, she thought George was moving them, but he was too young to arrange them so carefully. The dolls were always facing the same direction, toward the corner of the room where nothing interesting ever happened. One evening, Peppa decided to stay awake and watch the living room from the stairs. As the clock struck midnight, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The dolls began to move on their own, turning their heads in perfect synchronization to look at her hiding spot. Their plastic eyes seemed to gleam in the dim light, and their painted smiles appeared more sinister than friendly. The largest doll, one that looked remarkably like herself, stood up and began to walk across the coffee table with jerky, unnatural movements. The other dolls followed, creating a small procession that moved toward the stairs where Peppa was hiding. As they got closer, she could hear them whispering her name in tiny, tinny voices that sounded like recordings played at the wrong speed. The Peppa doll reached the bottom of the stairs and began to climb, its plastic feet making soft clicking sounds on each step. Behind it, the other dolls formed a line, all climbing toward her with their heads tilted at impossible angles. Peppa tried to run back to her room, but found that her legs wouldn't move. She was frozen in place, forced to watch as the dolls approached. The Peppa doll reached her step and looked up with eyes that were no longer painted plastic, but real, blinking eyes that looked exactly like her own. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Every night at exactly 3 o'clock, Peppa heard footsteps in the attic above her bedroom. The steps were small and light, like children running and playing, but when she asked her family about it, they insisted the attic was empty and had been sealed for years. The footsteps always followed the same pattern, running from one end of the attic to the other, then stopping abruptly. One night, Peppa decided to investigate. She found a ladder in the garage and climbed up to the attic hatch, which opened easily despite her parents' claims that it was sealed. Inside, the attic was filled with old toys and furniture covered in white sheets, but everything was arranged as if children had been playing there recently. Toy blocks were stacked in neat towers, dolls sat in a circle as if having a tea party, and a rocking horse moved gently back and forth despite the still air. In the corner, she found a family photo that looked exactly like her own family, but the faces were wrong, the eyes were too large, the smiles too wide, and everyone was looking directly at the camera with an intensity that made her skin crawl. As she examined the photo more closely, she heard the footsteps start again, but this time they were right behind her. She turned to see children who looked like distorted versions of herself and George, their faces pale and their eyes completely black. They were playing with toys that moved on their own, and when they noticed her watching, they all stopped and smiled in perfect unison. The attic children began to approach her slowly, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. Peppa tried to climb back down the ladder, but the hatch had vanished, leaving only solid ceiling above her. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa woke up in the middle of the night to find her bedroom filled with mirrors. Every wall, every surface reflected her image back at her, but something was wrong. The reflections moved just a moment too late, as if they were copying her rather than mirroring her. When she raised her hand, the reflections hesitated before following. Peppa tried to leave her room, but the door had vanished, replaced by another mirror. In this new reflection, she saw herself sleeping peacefully in bed, but she was standing right here, awake and frightened. The reflection Peppa in the mirror opened her eyes and smiled, revealing rows of sharp, gleaming teeth. All the other mirrors began to show different versions of Peppa, some with black eyes, some with twisted smiles, some that moved independently of her actions. The mirror Peppas began to whisper her name in unison, their voices echoing from every surface. As the whispers grew louder, the mirrors started to crack, spider-webbing outward from where each reflection stood. Peppa pressed her hands against her ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside her head. Suddenly, all the reflections stopped moving and stared directly at her with hollow, empty eyes. The real Peppa realized with growing horror that she could no longer see her own reflection anywhere. She had become invisible to the mirrors, while the false Peppas remained. The mirror Peppas began to step forward, their hands pressing against the glass from the inside, trying to break through into her world.
Peppa Pig, the quiet room. It all started with a whisper. "Daddy, what's that door?" Peppa asked when she noticed it at the end of the hallway. Small, pale blue, with a faded plaque and no name. It hadn't been there before. A door? Daddy Pig scratched his head. Probably a closet. I never noticed it. But the door wouldn't open. No handle, no lock. Just a faint draft seeping from underneath. The next day, the door stood wide open, as if it had been waiting. Peppa carefully peeked inside. The room was completely empty. White walls, dusty floor, no furniture, no windows, and no sound at all, not even her own breathing. "Hello," she said. But there was no sound. None. No echo, no noise. Her voice vanished. Then Mummy Pig stepped in, tried to say, "What did you find, Peppa?" But nothing came out. Her lips moved, but the silence was like concrete. Daddy Pig clapped his hooves. Still nothing. Even footsteps made no sound in there. They started calling it the quiet room and decided to stay away from it. But George, on the third day, he disappeared. Daddy Pig searched the whole house. Peppa peeked into the quiet room and saw his hooves. He was standing in the corner, silent, still, not turning around. She ran to him and shouted, "George, let's go!" And he vanished right in front of her eyes, as if he had dissolved. She tried to tell her parents, but no one believed her. The door slammed shut and wouldn't open again. The next morning, it was ajar. Inside, a dusty floor, and in the dust, 2 sets of hoofprints leading to the corner, but none leading back. Peppa took a notebook and pen, stepped inside, laid the notebook down, wrote, "Is there no way out?" The pen left no marks, as if anything connected to speech just disappeared. She stepped out. Silence rang in her ears. On the third day, she decided something had to be done. She entered the room, closed the door behind her, and then she heard it. Not a voice, a muffled moan. In the corner sat someone else, too tall, too thin, with a long face. It didn't move, but its eyes slowly blinked. Peppa clasped both hooves over her mouth, tried not to breathe, and then the figure turned its head, Slowly. Exactly. Peppa bolted from the room. Since then, she kept the door locked, taped shut. But every night, she heard heavy breathing behind it. And each morning, a message appeared on the wall near the door. You spoke.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa loved playing hide and seek with George, but today the game felt different. When she counted to 10 and opened her eyes, George was nowhere to be found. She looked in all his usual hiding spots behind the sofa, under the kitchen table, in the toy box, but he had simply vanished. Mummy Pig was in the kitchen making lunch, humming a cheerful tune. When Peppa asked where George was, Mummy Pig just smiled and said he was playing upstairs. But when Peppa went to check, George's room was empty. His bed was perfectly made, and his favorite dinosaur toy was sitting exactly in the center, staring at the door with its plastic eyes. Peppa called out for George throughout the house, but only her own voice echoed back. The strange thing was, sometimes the echo sounded different, younger, like George's voice, but saying words he had never learned to say. The echoes seemed to come from inside the walls themselves, as if George was trapped somewhere she couldn't see. Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper in the living room, but when Peppa asked him about George, he just pointed upstairs without looking up from his paper. The newspaper rustled strangely, and Peppa noticed that all the words on the pages were the same word repeated over and over. George, George, George. As evening approached, the family sat down for dinner. There were still 4 plates on the table, including George's favorite blue one. Mummy and Daddy Pig talked about George as if he was sitting right there, asking him to eat his vegetables and praising him for being such a good boy. They even laughed at things he supposedly said, though his chair remained empty. Peppa began to wonder if George had ever existed at all, or if she had imagined having a little brother. But then she found his drawings scattered around the house, pictures of dinosaurs and family stick figures. In every drawing, there were 3 pigs and 1 empty space where a 4th pig should have been, as if George had been drawing his own absence. That night, as Peppa lay in bed, she heard George's voice coming from his empty room next door. He was talking to someone, having a conversation in his usual simple words. But when she crept to his doorway to listen, the room was still empty, and the voice was coming from nowhere at all. Peppa realized that George might be playing the longest game of hide and seek ever, hiding so well that even he had forgotten where he was. She whispered into the darkness, promising that if he came back, she would let him win every game they ever played. But the only answer was the sound of her own voice, echoing back from somewhere far away, sounding smaller and younger than before.
Peppa Pig, the smiling one. It all started one evening, when the whole family was sitting in the living room. Daddy Pig was telling funny stories, George was giggling, and Mummy Pig was quietly smiling. Peppa laughed, loudly, sincerely, brightly, and then something else laughed too. Ha, ha, ha! It wasn't an echo, it was too slow, as if someone repeated her laugh, but not right away. Then again, ha, ha, ha! Peppa froze. Did you hear that? She asked. What, darling? Said Mummy Pig. Someone laughed with me, but weirdly. Probably the TV. Daddy Pig waved it off, but the TV was off. That night, Peppa woke up from silence. George was breathing softly, the house didn't creak. Everything was still. And then, ha, ha, ha. Now it came from outside the window. Peppa stepped up to the glass. Behind it, a figure, tall, thin, too thin. Its head was long, snout narrow, mouth stretched into a wide smile, like it was cut open. No teeth, eyes, hollow, black, empty. It didn't move, it just watched. Then it said, Peppa, in her voice, but delayed, as if it had heard it earlier and was now repeating it. Peppa jumped back, pulled the curtains shut and hid under her blanket. In the morning, she told no one, but at breakfast, George giggled again, and from outside the window came, he, the same voice, only closer. Did you hear that? She whispered to George. What? It laughs. When we laugh? Later that day, Peppa went to Mummy Pig. Who is he? Mummy Pig looked at the window. If you've seen him already, then he's close. He comes when someone laughs. He hears us through the laughter. What does he want? Mummy didn't answer. That night, Peppa woke up again. Everything was quiet, but on the window, a message from the inside, as if drawn by a foggy hoof. I like how you laugh. Below it, scratches, 5 long ones. The family photo on the wall had changed. Everyone smiled. But Peppa, her smile was different, a little wider, too symmetrical, and her eyes seemed hollow. In the evening, she heard him again, first at the window, then in the hallway, then right outside her bedroom door. He was repeating her words. Don't look, don't look. But she hadn't said that out loud, only thought it. In the mirror, he was there, standing behind her, smiling, long, without eyes, only a mouth. When Peppa turned, no one. I am you, he whispered, just with the smile turned inside out. Since then, Peppa doesn't laugh, and she doesn't let George laugh either, because with every laugh, he gets closer, and one day, he'll smile with her face. Peppa Pig, the box of drawings. It started on a quiet morning. Peppa woke up to a rustling sound. George was dragging something along the floor. In the hallway, she saw him carrying a cardboard box. Old, dusty, no writing on it. It looked like something forgotten in a basement. Where did you get that? Peppa asked. George didn't answer. He just smiled. He placed the box on the floor and opened it. Inside were drawings, dozens, some on torn scraps of paper, others fresh and colorful, all drawn by a child's hoof. Did you draw these? George stayed silent. The first drawing was simple. Peppa standing in the kitchen, a broken cup on the floor, Daddy with a broom, Mummy holding a rag. A few hours later, it happened, exactly like in the drawing, down to the smallest detail. Peppa dropped a cup, shards scattered. Daddy sighed. Mummy got the rag. Just a coincidence, Mummy said. But George pulled out the next drawing. It showed their garden, a ball stuck in the tree, Daddy holding a ladder, Peppa reaching up. The next day the ball really did get stuck, in the same place, exactly like the drawing. Peppa started going through the drawings. The further she went, the darker they became. The colors, duller. The figures, twisted. One showed Peppa's room at night. At the window, a silhouette. Faceless. Peppa shoved it to the bottom of the box. But that night she woke up, went to the window. For a moment, she thought someone had just stepped out of view. Another drawing, the bathroom, the mirror, Peppa's reflection smiling, even though she wasn't. Another one, George sleeping, and beside his bed stood a second George, identical, but with red crayon eyes. Peppa hid the box in the closet, but George found it again. He said, I have to keep watching. Every day, new drawings appeared, even though no one was drawing. One morning, at the very top of the pile, was a picture of that exact breakfast. The tablecloth, the cup, the toast, all correct. At the edge, a drop. Peppa thought it was paint, but it was tea. Then came a drawing of the living room. Daddy asleep in his chair, and behind him, someone reaching toward his shoulder. That evening, Daddy flinched. He said, I thought someone touched me. But the room was empty. At last, Peppa found the final drawing. It was black and white. It showed herself, standing alone in an empty room. No windows, no toys. Her face, blank. Arms limp at her sides, and behind her, the box, and written in neat handwriting, Now you're inside. That night, Peppa woke up. The room felt unusually dark, too quiet. On the floor, the box, empty. All the drawings were gone. Only one remained. It lay on top. It showed Mummy, Daddy, and George sitting at the table, smiling, laughing. But Peppa wasn't there, and at the bottom, written carefully, They don't remember you anymore.